Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here so early, and I hope you've had some coffee. My name's Alok Jha. I'm the Science and Tech Editor at The Economist. Now, we are here to talk about the geopolitics of science this morning. It's a heavy topic for such an early time. And specifically, if you look at not that anymore, but if you look at the title of this session, it's called Beyond the Duopoly, because when we think about geopolitics and power when it comes to science, you normally think, especially an informed audience will think of two countries, the US and China. And traditionally, the US has been the preeminent power when it comes to science. So China is now nipping at its heels, and in some respects is overtaken the US. And of course, in the US right now, many ructions going on with the science base. So we're here to talk about all of that, how it's shifting, how it might look in the future, and what anyone can do about it, what you need to know. To frame our discussion, though, I'm going to welcome onto stage Mehran. He is a technology strategist and the author of a new book, The New Geography of Innovation, the Global Contest for Breakthrough Technologies. And he will frame for us how this duopoly, or whatever you want to call it afterwards, the triopoly, I don't know what the word is, how it's changing, how it's going to move into the future. So he's going to talk to us first, and then after that, we will discuss a bit further with our panel, which I will introduce later. We'll discuss with them what it looks like for the next few decades. All right, Mehran, over to you.
Thank you, Alok, for that generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I will do something unusual for an author, which is instead of starting with my own book, I'll start with someone else's. In 2018, about 7 years ago, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, and Adrian Wooldridge came out with a book, Capitalism in America, which looked at the very important question, why is it that the US has, in terms of economic performance, stood head and shoulders above its European and Asian peers historically? And it ended on a somewhat downcast note, saying that the US is now becoming indistinguishable from other mature, slow-growth economies, such as Europe and Japan, in its handling of creative destruction. And so I read that book, and the natural question that comes up is, if the US is in decline, then who is ascendant? And is the center of gravity for where the most consequential developments in tech are taking place moving from the US to other places? And since then, the question has just become more urgent. We tend to see examples of this in the news every day, things about DeepSeek, about chips, about smartphones. So about 5 years ago, I started writing this book, and the question was, how does this picture come together more cohesively beyond sort of the headlines that we see every day? So it took me about 5 years to write the book. I interviewed over 200 people for this, traveled all over the world. Very happy to see that some of the people that I interviewed are at this conference as well. And before I maybe go into the broader findings, let's just start with, I think, one story which, in my view, kind of illustrates what's happening in very vivid terms. And this is a story about AI research, and it starts with this paper. Anyone who's in AI in this room would be familiar with this. It's a paper called Deep Residual Learning for Image Recognition, also called ResNet. It came out of a lab in Beijing in 2015. It has, over the span of about a decade, become the most cited paper in the world in artificial intelligence. It is also the most cited paper ever in computer science. It is, in fact, the most cited paper in any scientific field published in the 21st century, and well on its way to becoming the most cited paper ever. ResNet was authored by 4 scientists of Chinese origin. The interesting thing about them is that they all got their undergraduate, graduate, and PhD degrees in China. None of them had worked outside of China prior to publishing their landmark paper. All of them have won other major awards in artificial intelligence as well. And the way that the outside world looks at these 4 scientists at times captures the wider ambivalence with which the Western world tends to look at the rise of China in AI in specific and science more broadly. For instance, the first name up there, Kai-Ming He, he's now a full professor at MIT, also a distinguished fellow at DeepMind. The third name that you see in there, Jian Sun, He unfortunately passed away recently, but prior to that, he was the chief scientist at Megvii, which is a major artificial intelligence company in China, and he was under active sanctions by 3 different US agencies. So 2 scientists both have worked on a very notable paper, but the way the US receives them is very different. Now, you might look at that and say, maybe they just got lucky. Maybe this is just one example of Chinese science. It doesn't mean that there's something broader going on there. So maybe let's look at Chinese research from another angle. The names and faces that you have in front of you right now belong to one of the most distinguished AI research labs in the world right now. You might look at the slide and say, maybe this is the team behind DeepSeek, maybe this is Baidu, maybe this is Tencent, but this is actually most of the new superintelligence lab that Mark Zuckerberg has been putting together. Most of the names and faces in that labs are not just of Chinese origin, but most of them went to just 3 universities in China. And they are some of the highest compensated people in the field. They occupy some of the highest ranking positions at Meta Superintelligence Lab. The name in the center over there, Shenjia Zhao, for instance, he did his undergrad at Tsinghua University, which has become a major center in AI. He is now the chief scientist at Meta's new superintelligence lab, having previously worked at OpenAI on GPT-3 and GPT-4. So it's now being commented on that most of the world's AI talent is Chinese, and you don't have to take my word for it. People, stalwarts in the industry have commented on this, and we talk about the question about whether the US is ahead in AI or China is ahead in AI. Maybe somebody has a lead in open source, others have a lead in closed source. But if I were to reframe the question and say, is Chinese talent in the lead in AI globally? The answer to that is unequivocally yes. And we can see that in other numbers as well. What you have in front of you right now are the acceptance rate of papers accepted to the top 5 AI conferences in the world. And over the past 10 years, China has become the most represented country in top-tier AI conferences. And now up to a half of all papers accepted at these conferences have at least one researcher who is based in China. And if I had thrown up this slide earlier and asked the audience, where do you think China stands now? I think most people would give me numbers from 2020 or 2015 that maybe it's 30%, maybe it's 35%. And I think this sort of illustrates that perceptions about China in the world lag reality by about 5 years. And that's not just something you see in AI research. It's something that you see in other areas as well. You see that in EVs, for instance, with 7 out of 10 EVs in the streets today, in the world globally, being made in China. We see that in chips as well. So, and in AI, you see that sort of very vividly. Again, anyone who is even tangentially related to artificial intelligence would recognize the name, the face in front of you. This is Geoffrey Hinton, pioneer for neural nets. He had the most cited paper in AI and in computer science called AlexNet before ResNet came along. And and obviously a Nobel Prize winner. The interesting fact there being that there is no Nobel Prize in computer science, but such was the scale of his achievement that they gave him one anyway. So I had a chance to interview Dr. Hinton recently, and I asked him a pretty straightforward question, which is, in your opinion, which country is leading in AI now and will have the lead in AI in the future? And his answer was straightforward. It's going to be China. Beyond this one case study, what does the map of innovation in the world look like? It does seem as if, as opposed to the past 50 years, where just about whenever we talked about technology, we only ever talked about one country, it does seem like more consequential developments are coming from more places. The question of what is the most consequential tech company in the world can have many different answers. Is it NVIDIA? Is it OpenAI? But the fact that TSMC, a company based in Taiwan, can make a credible claim to being the most important commercial entity in the world gives you a sense of the sorts of changes that we're seeing in the world right now. And we see this not just in China, but in other places as well. Spotify is the world's most used streaming service. Some of the most popular games that we see in the world, like Minecraft, Candy Crush, Angry Birds, they came from gaming studios in the Nordics. So, which leads to the question, and BYD at this point sells more cars, more EVs, just EVs, than the entire German car industry sells any kind of car. So, which raises the question, beyond the US and China, what is happening out there? What are the countries that are the most consequential? In my book, I use 3 different approaches. First is to look at it from the angle of how a venture capitalist would look at this question. And over there, the map of the world looks something like this. Who's producing the most billion-dollar companies? Add another layer to this and say, well, who's getting the most funding in the world? And the map of the world there looks something like this. And the drawback of these approaches is that they're only looking at new companies at a time when NVIDIA is more valuable than the entire economy of India and Japan. It's hard to make the argument that innovation only happens in new companies. So if you look at the map of the world based on cumulative market cap of both old companies and new ones, the map of the world looks something like this. And just to sort of not be vulnerable to the criticism that we're only looking at valuations and looking at innovation in a very narrow way, let's also throw in WIPO's Global Innovation Index, which maybe throws up a very unorthodox list of countries. Now, this is a talk called Beyond the Duopoly, and I wouldn't get away with just talking about the US and China. So let's maybe have a look at an example from South Korea. So the question is, what do these examples beyond the US and China have to teach us? And the answer is a lot. If you look at South Korea, it's an interesting case study for how a country has managed to overcome the innovator's dilemma. Anyone who's been to business school would be familiar with this book, but just to recap, the innovator's dilemma is this idea that for some reason, the dominant tech power of one age just gets completely blindsided by the next big technological wave. So whether it's Kodak in digital photography, Nokia in smartphones, Blockbuster and streaming, one dominant power just completely misses the boat. And we've come to understand that as the normal way in which business takes place. It's creative destruction. One wave gets replaced by the next. But for some reason, South Korean companies are an exception to that. They've been around for almost 100 years. If you look at a company like Samsung, for instance, it is the only phone manufacturer that survived the seismic shift from analog handhelds to smartphones. And it actually went from number 2 to number 1, so it went in the opposite direction. And it's responsible for about a quarter of the entire Korean GDP. So anyone in this room who runs a big company and thinks that it's inevitable that a startup will eventually eat your lunch should probably have a closer look at companies like Samsung and Hyundai, which have somehow managed to always adapt to the next big technological wave. Before we conclude, I want to talk about why is it important to talk about countries beyond the US and China when we talk about tech. If you look at the past 70-odd years and who won the major technological shifts, it's consistently been the US one wave after another. And when it comes to the next big shift, which is AI, it looks as though it's maybe going to be the US or China, but it's not like we're seeing major models or major developments come from other places all that often. And one of the panelists yesterday had referenced the most valuable tech companies in the US. And just to give you an idea of how skewed the economic outcomes are at the moment, these are the top 10 most valuable companies in the US. Their combined market cap is 23 trillion. People don't have a very good sense of numbers when they get very, very big. So just to give you a sense, the combined market cap of just the 10 major American tech companies is greater than the entire GDP of every country in the world except the US itself. And so, we often talk about tech in terms of is the US winning, in China winning? The answer is they're both doing really well. If you look at 1990, US percentage of global GDP was 25%. Today, it's still 25%. In 1990, China's share of global GDP was 1.9%. Today, it's 19%. China is growing, but not at the expense of the US. It's growing at the expense of other rich world economies, like those in Europe. And you can see that in the numbers. US share of G7 GDP used to be 37% in 1995. Today, it's at 57%. So the question is not who's winning, the US or China. They're both doing very well. And we can see that in, for instance, the number of foundation models that came out last year and how many of them were from the US, China, and Europe. I'd conclude with something that was said to me by a very major European policymaker. It's not about Europe choosing sides. It's not, oh, we'll shelter under sort of American supremacy or we'll do deals with China, because fundamentally for Europe, this is not about values, this is about power. And they said that it's very striking that people realize that the last two platform shifts of internet and mobile created just a staggering amount of US soft and sometimes hard power. And I think there's a general recognition, Macron gets it, Starmer gets it, that AI looks to be a platform shift and technological shift of the same scale. And if Europe doesn't try and play, then it'll just exacerbate what we saw in the post-97, 98 era. And so with those words, we'll pass things off to the panel who will go into some of these topics in more detail. Thank you.